Welcome, everybody, and thanks for attending. I'm always excited to do this after lunch. I hope you've had a lot of discussions outside. My biggest worry at this point is, am I going to disagree with what everybody said earlier today? On the other hand, I've always thought if you hear the same thing from me again, why is everybody thinking the same thing, is probably just as discouraging. So what I want to do is take you through the thinking that we have as Walmart on how do we compete in such a fast evolving environment as e-commerce. And as David had mentioned, there are a lot of things that are common across many businesses. And we look at some of those commonalities rather than looking at specific markets. So there are two core processes, and I've heard some of these being discussed today, there's an emerging market middle class. That affects lots and lots of different businesses. You've probably heard other people talk about that, so I'm not going to touch on it. We've talked about aging. There's a big discussion in China around whether China will get old before it gets rich. Again, that's a topic that a lot of people can talk about. You don't need to hear me talk about that one. But there's a couple of others I really want to spend some time on. One is how technology is evolving. We wouldn't have a business without companies like Lenovo. Without a computer, without a wireless, without those devices, we can't work. So there's a lot going on in that technology that I want to talk about as an industrial user rather than as an individual user. And then the more recent one is social networks. I'm assuming everybody here is on a social network in one way or the other, but how do companies actually use it? I know you all use it as an individual to keep in touch with friends, colleagues, family members, and so forth. But there are uses for social networks on the business side as well, so I want to touch upon some of those. The first, obviously, is on technology. Where are people adapting to new mobile technology? And the good thing is, in the emerging markets, there are a huge number of these devices already out there. Now, what we consider actually a connected device is not the traditional mobile phone, but what we call a smartphone. So I could almost ask by a show of hands here, who's got an iPhone, an Android phone, or an iPad? That's the group we're talking to. Now, it's not surprising that in here, that's probably the majority. But overall, what we're actually finding is even our customer base in the US is becoming more and more connected. In emerging markets, it's a little bit more difficult. This is the higher end device. You can't get a smartphone for $40, but hopefully we're working with our partners to get you there. One of the things that's different now is a mobile phone is always on. There are good things about that and bad things. Obviously, we're always on from the business side. We can get a phone call any time of the night. But as you walk through our stores, you're also on. We know you're there, depending on how you've registered. And it's because we pick you up through the Wi-Fi system. If we've got enough information about you, we know you're in the store. Other things we do is you've probably tweeted. We get every single tweet that's ever been sent out. We keep it. We know what you've talked about. Now, that's scary in many ways, but in other ways, that's what we need to help kind of serve you the information that we're looking at to get you exactly what we want to get to you. So when I look at the social networks, where do people spend their time? Well, it used to be email. For me, it still is email, unfortunately. But most people are now spending their time online on social networks. Right? Facebook is by far the largest community globally. But there are many others. Foursquare. I don't know how many of you participate in that. Coming out of California, that's a very typical activity there. We are the single largest site of check-ins in the world at Walmart. So again, that has to do with our size, is people tell other people that they're at Walmart. If that's where you're spending your time, we have to be there. So how do we transact economically on a Facebook? What are the activities that we want to do on Facebook to really engage you where you want to be? The other thing is obviously from a branding, as David had talked about. When you look about what brand do I buy, what's the right TV I want to get, you're not going to ask Walmart and you're not going to ask Sony. You're going to ask your friends as to what's the right TV for you. So how do we keep track of the conversations that are going on social networks to figure out what are the right products that we should be having in the store? So where does that leave us with e-commerce? And this is one of the things when you're at Walmart. It's currently a $1 trillion business. That's large by any scale, but we don't think that's big enough. We see it growing dramatically over the next 5 years, and that's as far as we're willing to go even with an outlook. and we know we're going to be significantly off on this number. So where is it happening? The surprising thing is the US. The growth rate in the US is still significant, right? Low single digits. When you look at retail growth, and you've probably seen our quarterly numbers, or at least heard about it, is we're finally positive again. So if in the stores we're slightly positive, e-commerce is growing 13%. That tells you we, as the world's largest bricks and mortars retailer, have a problem. People are shifting to e-commerce. So how do we compete in e-commerce? How do we change what's been an extremely successful business model with the supercenters, where we revolutionized retail a couple of times? Now we're at the tail end of it. How do we keep up with e-commerce? The other huge growth area is the one we're here about, which is Asia. Growing at 20%, we probably think it's going to be more than that. And that is almost a very large portion of that comes out of China. So how do we compete in markets like China? And in China, we've got a couple of issues. If you look at the developed markets, yes, there is growth happening. It's relatively slow, but you can see more growth will come out of e-commerce than will come out of bricks and mortar retail in developed markets over the next 5 years. That, for us, is an ongoing challenge. As I mentioned, in the US, we have 4,000 stores. How do we keep the traffic in those stores? It's a fixed asset. Anybody on the finance side knows you've got a fixed expense. You've got to cover that. So we can't lose people to e-commerce. So we've got to find ways to bring them into the stores through e-commerce. On the developing side, it's a very different story. Yes, it's the same amount, if not more growth overall, but on a relative basis, it's still much smaller. So we will continue to build stores in emerging markets, but again, it's that interaction between the store and the e-commerce business that we will be different. When you think of most e-commerce players, they don't have as many stores as we do. Actually, nobody has as many stores as we do. But it's an ability that we have to really push the agenda, is to say, how do we get you in the store? We don't want you to be thinking about Walmart as an e-commerce business or an offline business. We're one business. How do we integrate that? How do we make that as consistent as possible as we can? There's more data available in the US, so I'm using it to really drive the discussion, which is really, how do people go shopping? When you think about your shopping decisions, I can give you two extremes. One is consumer electronics. I've just moved back from Hong Kong to California, so we had to buy new TVs, computers, and things like that. I didn't buy anything in the store. I did go look at the store, but for me, this was what we call continuous channel activity. You go back between online and offline to figure out where you want to buy the product. My final purchase happened online. But that was only after looking at what people said about the TVs, which ones they liked, what's the coming technology, who do I talk to, right? We have a great business which, relatively unknown, but we stream movies from our sites. So I asked the movie guys, what's the best technology, right? Again, trusting friends more than I trust what the companies say is the right thing to do. But the final transaction happened online. But how do we, as a retailer, keep track of how you make your decisions, how do we influence your decisions, and how do we keep those going? I can take the other end, as Boston is one of the few markets where I think you can order your groceries in the US. I think Peapod is still the player here. That's a very cumbersome business, right? It's with groceries, fresh groceries. I have a Chinese mother-in-law. She doesn't buy stuff online, right? She wants to touch and feel the food before she takes it. So that's a business that's much, much harder to convert. So you see that bottom 23%, that's not going to go away anytime soon. But how do we make that process work that no matter where and what you want to do, we're the retailer you go to? We hope, because we have every different facet of shopping, that you come to us, but we got to convince you. And the reasons we have to convince you is, unfortunately, by going online, one of our biggest kind of defensible positions has gone away. If you want to compete with Walmart in stores in the US, it's pretty difficult, right? We have an established base of 4,000 stores. We have scale. We have a logistics model. If you want to open retail positions, first of all, it's expensive. Building a store costs a lot of money. It's got to work. That's a hard business to get into. I think every single company you see on this list is effectively 10 years old from an e-commerce perspective. One or two exceptions here. But let me just take you a little bit around how these business models have evolving. Netflix, right? It came out of the DVD business. But at this point, if you look at media sales in large formats, so us, Best Buy, well, Circuit City doesn't even exist anymore. That business is moving online. Why do you actually need a physical disk? I can get this through broadband. So that's changing the business model here completely. Google and Baidu. You used to go to Walmart because you assumed we had most products. Well, in Google, you can search for anything, right? And Google will tell you where to go. We no longer play that role of being the information point when you want to go shopping. When I look at brands, a lot of these large brands now have their own store. You don't need to go to Walmart, right? When you type in Nike, the chance of it showing up as Walmart is almost zero. But you can go to the Nike store. If Nike can give you that product directly, what do they need a retailer for, right? We don't add a lot of value if they can do it themselves. So how do we keep ahead of the brands and keep them relevant to what we do? From an experience perspective, two of these companies I think you'll know, Zappos and Amazon, now together. Netshoes is very similar to Zappos, comes out of Brazil. Who would have thought you'd buy shoes online, right? It's just, you got to try them on. Are they comfortable? Well, if I don't like it, what do I do? Right, this is just an evolution of the catalog business. People order 10 shoes from Zappos and send 9 of them back. Right, it works as a business model, but that's obviously a new challenge, right, from a logistics perspective. Shipping it out, putting it back into inventory. How do you do all these things? Those processes and technologies are now available, so you're willing to buy things online that you would have never thought of before. And then the social network. If that's where you're spending your time, a lot of consumer goods, obviously coming out of Pepsi, we do advertising, or did advertising. We've got to be in different places now. We've got to be where you are. So almost everything that we do is changing. And as you can imagine, for a $400 billion company to change isn't the easiest thing in the world. So how do we drive that change forward in a company the size of Walmart? I think what we've just come to is the kind of conclusion that we don't have a lot of choice about this. When you think about the typical business school case, a lot of them revolve around the P&G brand manager. That was a big discussion when I was in business school, right? The brand manager leading the brand, deciding where to go with the brand. That's, in our perspective, a slightly older business model. We came in, Target came in, Carrefour internationally, Tesco has had a great run. Retailers have taken a lot of stronger positions. When I was at Pepsi, going to Walmart was always a challenging discussion. Retailers didn't make a lot of money off these hypermarkets, but you had to be there. So it moved the balance of power a little bit to retail. That's happened over the last 20 years, probably until kind of early this decade. But over the last 10 years with technology, everybody around here has the power now as an end consumer. When you think about the difficulties of finding out about a product, right? You don't trust the brand manager anymore in telling you what's good for you. You use your friends. You can switch stores, right? Once you're at a Walmart, we have a standalone store. It's difficult to go to Target, right? It's just not a change you do. Online, it's not that difficult, right? You click on the search, you get all 10 retailers, you click again, and you're at a different retailer. It gets even worse, right? Is you take your iPhone into our store, you see what we have, you go to Amazon online and say, well, I like theirs better. It's a huge challenge we have on keeping the customer engaged. And what we now really have to do as a retailer is look at you as a customer. One way to look at it is, who's the economic entity that we deal with? In traditional retail, it's the store. Right? We have about 4,000 stores in the US. We have 4,000 store P&Ls. That's the way we look at it. That's no longer true. Right? You as a customer could interact with us online. You may have 5 or 6 Walmarts you use, right? One at work, one at home. How do we make sure we keep track of you, because you become the economic entity that we really have to track? And that is a very different behavior from what we used to do as a retailer. So how do we get there, and what are the things we have to do?